From the moment Mick and Keith met through to U2 as a high school band in Dublin, how did our biggest music legends make the leap? Passion, talent, luck, and even scandal often came together to propel these stars from obscurity to household name. The stories, the journey, the wild behind the scenes, and much more. I'm Dave Anthony, and I'm the host of From Garage to Stadiums.
Welcome to Garage to Stadiums. Today's episode is the story of the Cars. This is the story of a band that ultimately achieved platinum records, but slugged it out during many lean years in Boston, trying different musical styles from folk to rock to punk in half-empty bar gigs, broken vans, and enough side hustles just to keep the lights on. And their lead singer and songwriter, Rick Ocasek, wasn't just chasing a sound, he was supporting a young family, betting everything on songs no label quite understood. Alongside him, bassist and vocalist Benjamin Orr brought the voice and charisma that kept hopes alive through these failed lineups and near misses. And when New Wave cracked open in the late 70s, the Cars hit the ignition switch. Sleek, emotional, and electrifying, bridging punk nerve with pop precision and helping define the sound of a new decade. They would go on to a succession of hits, proving that they had the sound and the vibe for the early to mid 80s. If there's one episode that typifies the massive odds against completing the Garage to Stadiums journey, this story might be the one. Here to discuss the Cars story is Peter Aaron, author of Moving in Stereo, that has the subtitle Rick Ocasek, the driving force behind the Cars. Peter is a veteran of the music industry. He's written on acts like the Ramones and the Band, and he's the arts editor of Chronogram magazine. He's also the frontman of influential New York band the Chrome Cranks. His writing has appeared in the Village Voice, the Boston Herald, and several other publications. He joins us today from the Hudson Valley in Kingston, New York. Welcome to Garage to Stadiums, Peter.
Thank you so much, Dave. Very happy to be here.
Peter, what's the background of why you chose the Cars and Rick Ocasek to profile?
I loved them when they came out, and those first few albums were collectively a big deal to me. I was right at the age to really register. It's 1978. I was 14, 15, sometime around there when the first album came out. And he seemed like an interesting guy and obviously very deep, complex, and I wanted to know more about him. And there wasn't that much out there. So it's really as simple as that.
You put a lot of research into this profile of Rick. To do such a 360-degree profile, you talk to family members, you talk to band members, you talk to friends. This must have yielded some interesting portraits of Rick. By all accounts, he was a pretty secretive guy.
Yeah, that's really why it was like being an archaeologist and combined with, I don't know, a private investigator or something. He covered his tracks really well. So to really get a good picture, the interviews that ran in magazines and outlets like that were only going to be useful to a certain point. Trying to talk to people around him, it was really the only way to really get a bit of a grip on what he was like. I tracked down his sister, his younger sister, who no one had spoken to ever before, Maureen Ocasek Roars. And she was very sweet and very helpful. So that was a good place to start.
Mm-hmm. Rick seems like obviously the leader of the Cars, but they're often bands have those two principles, Jagger, Richards, Lennon, McCartney, Fry, and Henley, etc. There's two main principles that come through in your book. And one is, of course, lead singer Rick Ocasek and bassist and sometime vocalist Benjamin Orr. Can you tell us a little bit about their early lives as kids and their family life, where they came from?
Yeah, well, Rick was born Richard Ocasek in the Baltimore area in 1944. And later on, he dropped the T from his name to make it, I guess you'd say, more streamlined. And when his father worked for NASA, working with early computer systems, technical side. And then when Rick was about 16 years old, the family moved to the Cleveland, Ohio area when his dad got a job. And Rick was very much an introvert and a loner. He got picked on a lot because he was tall and socially awkward. He was very influenced early on by beat writers. He spent a lot of time reading the beat poets like Ginsberg, and especially Lawrence Ferlinghetti was a big influence on him as a lyricist. This sort of surreal style that he and other beat writers used. And his first musical influence came before he moved to Ohio. He'd heard Buddy Holly, that's single "That'll Be the Day" on the radio when he was about 14. And he has said that was what made him want to play guitar and write songs. His grandmother bought him a guitar when he was 14, and that's how he started playing. And so his family moved to Ohio when he was 16, and he bounced around in early college days and ended up getting a job at Ohio Bell telephone company based in Columbus. He moved there, and Benjamin Orr had grown up in Cleveland. His name was Benjamin Orzechowski. People called him Benny, 11 letters. He had been in a band called the Grasshoppers, who were the big local Cleveland Beatles style band. They actually had a couple singles out. One of them got picked up by Warner Brothers, a song called Mod Socks. It was a regional hit. And they were on the house band on a TV show that was like the local American Bandstand teen dance show. And so it seems like Rick would have had an awareness of who he was, but it's a little bit fuzzy, the circumstances around their meeting. But it seems to be the way it went was Rick was in Columbus. He had started a band called Id Nirvana. And I guess you could say they were a sort of a psychedelic band of the time. This is the mid to late 1960s. And around 1969 or so, Benjamin Orr is visiting Columbus because he wants to start a booking agency and get into booking bands from the promotion side of things. He'd already been in a few bands, and obviously everyone knows that in the music business, everyone makes money, but the bands, the promotion side, a lot of musicians get into that side. So he went to see Id Nirvana and liked them, and then they ended up hanging out at Rick's apartment after the show. And on Rick's acoustic guitar, Ben played and sang the Beatles' Yesterday. And Rick was so blown away by his voice that he asked him to join Id Nirvana. And that's really the beginning of their musical partnership.
One thing that's surprising to me as I read the book, because you picture the Cars as part of that new wave movement that took over in kind of the late 70s, early 80s, was Rick was born in 1944. He's in the Mick Jagger era.
Yeah.
He's older when he got big. I want to remind the audience, this fellow really slugged it out, as we'll find out here. But in the meantime, he's already married and he's got kids in the mid-60s.
Yeah, he's got married right out of high school and had his first son, Christopher, not long after that. And he was very much artistically consumed and was focused more on playing music. And that ended up causing problems at home, as it does sometimes. Was out playing and checking out other bands a lot of the time.
And you wrote that during the day he'd be practicing in the basement, not even really paying attention to the family.
Yeah, it seemed like it was conflicted about getting dragged into the sort of traditional post-war family life. His father was a very conservative guy, and he didn't want that at the time and wanted to connect and express his creative side. And he was being a loner and wanting some kind of validation that sort of subconsciously pulled him deeper and deeper into wanting to be a musician and create. And then he ended up splitting up with his first wife, a woman named Connie, and it They split up during the time she was pregnant with their second son. So it was a bit of a rocky situation there.
In the early 1970s, Rick and Benjamin Wojciechowski relocate to Boston and formed the band called Milkwood. And surprisingly, for the guy who is synonymous with new wave, this was more in that early 70s folk rock, Crosby, Stills, Nash, like harmony band.
Right.
And when you play songs like Linkin Park off that first album that they put out, man, that was the most shocking fact in your book, was that the guys who fronted the Cars were actually the full-on sort of folkies with the requisite full long hair and mustaches and fringed coats.
Yeah, well, it's surprising in a way, but not so much when you think about it. So, but between Id Nirvana and Milkwood, Id Nirvana morphed into a band called Leatherwood, which is a little bit of in that vein too. From what there's no recordings that exist that have come out, but from what I understand, they had a little bit of that sound too. So yeah, 1972, Rick had already moved out to the Cambridge area, and he got Ben to move out with them. They had been in Michigan a little bit before that, in New York, and then Ben went back to Cleveland after his father died. But yeah, what you're saying with the sound of the band, the folk rock style, like very much Crosby, Stills, and Nash sound, which was the sort of dominant sound for original rock music around the time that they started in 1971, 72. It does seem incongruous, but harmonies, vocal harmonies were a big part of that sound, that Crosby, Stills, and Nash sound that Milkwood had. And you hear that very much on the first Cars album, but that's an important element of the early Cars sound that they developed by playing folk rock a la Crosby, Stills, and Nash with Milkwood. So in a way, it's not such a shock that they would have done music in that style before the Cars.
Yeah, that's a good point. They evolved into different iterations of bands, because in 1973, 74, they formed a band called Richard and the Rabbits.
Yeah.
And that was with Benjamin Orr, of course.
Yes. It was always with Benjamin Orr, and Rick and Ben. They were playing together in bands for about 8 years before the Cars. There was definitely a inseparable partnership there. One of Rick's other big influences, along with Bob Dylan as a lyricist and songwriter, was the Velvet Underground. And he had seen the Velvet Underground a lot when he lived in Cleveland. Cleveland was one of the few cities where the Velvet Underground were accepted and were popular. And when he moved to the Boston area in 71, one of the first bands, the very first band he saw was the Modern Lovers, which was a band fronted by Jonathan Richman, who suggested the name Richard and the Rabbits. Jonathan and Rick had gotten to be friends. And when Rick told him he was starting a new band, he said, "Oh, you got to call it Richard and the Rabbits." And of course, the drummer for the Modern Lovers was Dave Robinson, who becomes drummer for the Cars. Jumping ahead of ourselves a little bit. Even though the sort of proto-punk sound of the Modern Lovers and the Velvet Underground were big influences, early influences on Rick, he was trying other things that seemed to be the styles of the moment. When he was writing the music for Richard and the Rabbits, a little bit of Steely Dan, a bit of soft rock stuff. And the sound was not defined. It was kind of all over the place.
Yeah. That really came through in the book, how these guys slugged it out for years playing. And the evolution of the sound, like you said, they start with the Crosby, Stills, Nash. They're evolving to this Velvet Underground, Steely Dan. Like they tried literally every formula of music, it seemed.
Yeah, it was. And I think Rick wanted to make it. He was just learning, getting inside different styles and learning how those styles worked, and maybe taking different things from them and figuring out what to hang on to and what could be combined with something else. But he hadn't found his true self yet. He's going through trying different things and trying to come up with something original.
So Richard and the Rabbits evolves to a band called Captain Swing, which, like you said, he's got this affinity for Velvet Underground. But ultimately, they are starting to work some early versions of Cars tunes. And that leads us to late 76, the Cars are formed. But in June 78, they finally evolve into the sound that'll ultimately take them to the top. And you painted it well. That album has Good Times Roll, My Best Friend's Girl, Just What I Needed, Bye Bye Love, You're All I've Got Tonight, Moving in Stereo. They were fortunate to recruit producer Roy Thomas Baker, who had worked with Queen on the breakthrough Queen album, The Night at the Opera in 1975. What were the sounds that they combined to make this kind of car sound?
It does seem incongruous, but harmonies, vocal harmonies were a big part of that sound, that Crosby, Stills and Nash sound that Milkwood had. And you hear that very much on the first Cars album. Obviously, Good Times Roll is a prime example of that. Those vocal harmonies that that Roy Thomas Baker, with his production style, what he'd done with Queen, he was able to take full advantage of it. But that's an important element of the early Cars sound that they developed by playing folk rock a la Crosby, Stills and Nash with Milkwood. There was some of the things we were just talking about. You hear Rick's first influence, Buddy Holly, in his vocal style.
That's a great point. Actually, I'd like you to illuminate that Buddy Holly staccato.
Yeah. And the overall sort of timbre of his voice was on the quirky side too. And that was one thing that really worked for the Cars in the time they were evolving. You had bands with singers like David Byrne with Talking Heads, or Tom Verlaine with Television, or Mark Mothersbaugh with Devo, or David Thomas with Pere Ubu. You had Ben, who was like just a flat out great singer in the traditional way, but you had this sort of expressive, weird style that Rick did, with throwing a little bit of that hiccupy Buddy Holly style in there too.
Yeah.
And that's something that another point in history might not have been acceptable to enough people, but he was able to couch that within, some elements from 50s rockabilly style songwriting, some elements from the sort of arty, abrasive Velvet Underground style, the electronic pulse type feel of Kraftwerk and Suicide. He was taking these things and putting them together in a way that worked together. And with the bands that he had before, Richard and the Rabbits and Cap'n Swing, and there was still some jammy, Steely Dan meets overly ambitious kind of prog rock type tropes banging around, and there wasn't focused songs that the pop element with enough weird touches in there to keep it interesting. They hadn't honed that style yet, but it really came together at exactly the right time.
It's almost like a 50s to the future amalgamation of punk, electro synth, and rockabilly. It all came together. It's really interesting.
Yeah, with obvious pop elements of, there's some 1960s bubblegum
harmonies.
Yeah, I mean, Just What I Needed. The opening from that is lifted from Yummy, 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 I've Got Love in My Tummy.
Oh, that's right.
I think,
That's right.
Yeah, and it's not a blatant or flat out, but it's clever. And you get the people that are lean toward hummable melodies, but you also get the people that lean toward something that's weirder.
That 78 self-titled debut album was a massive commercial success. Peaked at 6 times platinum certification. Just unbelievable. It spent 139 weeks on the charts, solidifying the stardom that they were experiencing. The Cars' second album, Candio, was released in June 1979, with singles Let's Go, the major hit, at number 14, followed by It's All I Can Do, number 41, and Double Life peaking at number 3 on the US Billboard 200 and earning 4 times platinum certification. Critics praised it as a new wave classic with a more polished sound, produced again by Roy Thomas Baker. Younger fans of this podcast, Peter, give them a sense of how big they were after this second album release and how atypical it is almost to have 2 successful albums in a row.
Yeah, especially now when everything is so short attention span, one moment to the next moment. To have 2 albums that sold that well right in a row, and let alone the success of their very first album on the level that it was. I mean, they were jokingly referring to it when they were touring on that album as their greatest hits album, even though it's their first album. Yeah, highly unusual. It's a band that was lucky if they had one hit record at that anywhere near that level, and to have two of them be that successful with that many hit singles and to sustain that over a couple of years is not something that is going to be repeated just because the music industry is not what it was.
The next album was Panorama, 1980. Had a song called Touch and Go, which was fairly popular. The album peaked at number 5 in the US. It achieved platinum status, with Touch and Go noted for its distinct 50s style melody. But Peter, this album didn't do as well as the first two, and it marked a bit of a change in the sound for the band. How would you characterize that sound change?
Well, it's interesting. A lot of people call that the Cars Devo album, but it was very much a left turn. The first couple albums had, for the Cars, some pretty straightforward pop songs that became huge hits. And by the time that they were getting ready to do Panorama, the band Suicide was becoming more of an influence on them, and Rick especially. In fact, he produced their second album at the same time, roughly, that the Cars were making Panorama. Came out in 1980. And it flopped. It was too weird and confusing for a lot of the fan base that they had built up. And a lot of the more underground listeners had moved on from the Cars because they'd become a big hit band, and they weren't embracing it because they weren't following the Cars anymore. So it put them in kind of a weird place. But in retrospect, it's come to be viewed as one of their best albums. I think it definitely deserves another look for anyone that maybe didn't get it at the time.
In 83, Rick Ocasek releases a solo album. It's called Beatitude.
And again, that's a really experimental album and confused a lot of people.
I thought he sounded like his vocals sounded like a combination of Lou Reed of the Velvet Underground singing in front of Kraftwerk.
Yeah. Well, that's a great description. Both of those artists were obviously, like we said, big influences on him. You've got that song, Jimmy has that vocoder treatment on the vocals. Yeah, it's a cool record.
They returned to form with Shake It Up in 1981. That album peaked at number 9 in the US. Shake It Up single was their first top 10 single. I was surprised to read that.
Yeah, and another early MTV staple. 1981 is like right at the time that MTV was newly on the air.
The next album was interestingly recorded in London, and that was Heartbeat City, 1984. And you mentioned MTV. This might have been peak MTV for the Cars. They had You Might Think. They had Magic, which was sung by Ocasek, and Drive, which was sung by Benjamin Orr. And Hello Again. 2 top 10 Billboard hits in the US. You Might Think at number 7, and Drive became a massive hit with Benjamin's smooth voice on vocals.
Yeah, that was the biggest Cars single ever by far, and the best-selling album.
What I find interesting about this album is the hiring of Mutt Lange, who was known as the producer of AC/DC's Back in Black and Def Leppard's Pyromania, which are both obviously pretty heavy guitar sounds. What do you think was the rationale there?
I think they just wanted to try something different, work with a different producer. They'd done 4 albums. Also, it seems to be part of the reason for that decision was that Roy Thomas Baker had taken a job as head of A&R at Elektra. So he was maybe not available to produce it. And Mutt Lange was sort of the producer at the moment. Rick loved AC/DC. He loved Back in Black. And Mutt Lange had also produced Highway to Hell. He loved those records, especially the guitar sounds. But the thing was that by the time they got to work with Mutt Lange, was focused more on working with the Fairlight synthesizer, which is kind of an early sampler, where they would collect sounds of instruments and sort of play them through a synthesizer piece of equipment. And he used that on the Def Leppard records. You talk about Def Leppard having guitar, but there was actually a lot of synthesizer samples of guitars being recorded in that way. It wasn't a live band in a room so much. So that's the way that Mutt Lange wanted to work with the Cars. And he's a very exacting producer.
The production tension started to mount during this album, as the recording of the album Heartbeat City was a slog under Mutt Lange, who was so meticulous that some members felt excluded from the process. Drummer David Robinson even had many of his parts replaced by programmed loop.
Yeah, when they started, they were told, oh, this should take 2 weeks, and they ended up being there 6 months. And the drums tracks that are on that album are not, for the most, not really natural drum tracks. Rick tried to get Mutt Lange to record David playing live in the room, and Mutt Lange gave it some sort of nominal try. And after, I guess, like 3 days, it was like, I can't get a sound that I like on this. Let's go back to using the electronic Fairlight synthesizer sampled drums. But when you listen to that record, it's got a signature sound, but it doesn't sound like a band playing live in a room. It works for the songs. But the first Cars album, obviously very layered, very separated instruments. And with the vocals, the harmony stacked the way that Roy Thomas Baker did it. Candy O is much more of a stripped down kind of garagey album. And so it's a long leap from those first two albums to the sort of processed sound of Heartbeat City. Sales-wise, it did the trick, and it was certainly driven, you might say, by the single drive, which crossed boundaries in terms of who it appealed to in the record-buying public.
Was that written by Rick and Benjamin, or just Rick?
Just Rick, yeah. And actually, he demoed it for Beatitude, and it was done with almost a low-key samba-style rhythm. And it didn't end up using the song, and Rick ended up reviving it for Heartbeat City. But one trick that really defines the Cars' characteristic sound is that Rick would sing the more straight-up pop songs, and a lot of times Ben would sing the kind of more dramatic, dark, and strange songs. And Ben's kind of smoldering, torchy, almost a separate clubby jazz singer style voice is just so perfect for that song.
The painstaking sessions for Heartbeat City were the beginning of the end for the Cars, although in the short term they paid big dividends. MTV absolutely exploded things for bands and created the demands to do a little bit different things when they released their albums. And the Cars became known for their videos. Rick was the quirky new waver, perfect for TV screens. Ben Orr was the handsome leading man that MTV videos loved. Give the younger audience a sense of how important videos were and how the Cars delivered in that regard to really break them out.
Yeah, it was a whole new outlet for popular music. It was very novel at the time. Now it's very much taken for granted, especially because you can make your own video and put it on YouTube. You can let people see you playing your music. That was not a common thing at that time. And MTV was 24 hours, videos, music videos around the clock. They needed videos to fill that time. So the Cars were fortunate enough to be a band that existed in the right place at the right time and had the record company budgets to make videos. And so the Cars had done things for that, but they didn't want to get into videos. And it seemed to be because they thought videos were sort of a cheesy passing thing it was just like the novelty would wear off a lot more quickly. And the record company really pushed them, their management pushed them to get into doing videos for songs around the time of Panorama. And their manager was a guy named Elliot Roberts, and he worked with mainly singer-songwriters like Jackson Browne and Joni Mitchell, but he also worked with Devo. And Gerald V. Casale, the bass player for Devo, had worked on videos for Devo and wanted to get into making videos for other bands too. The Cars ended up hiring them to make videos for Panorama and Touch and Go. So they really didn't, they got into it reluctantly. But with MTV became the way we could circumvent radio airplay, and kids were just riveted by it. It was a whole new thing.
You might think was the one where he was like a fly, Rick's face on
Yeah.
a fly flying around. That was a popular video.
Yeah, well, that ended up winning the very first MTV Video Music Award.
Mm.
And it was very novel and cutting edge. There was a lot of early CGI type technique that was used. The rest of the band was standing on a bar of soap, floating in bathtub, playing. But yeah, it was goofy, but it was very gripping and striking for the time. And they ended up winning the very first MTV Music Award, beat out Michael Jackson Thriller, which was like an epic video. They were one of the bands that was like the face of MTV when MTV was new. They were inescapable. So yeah, they made waves outside of music. By the mid 1980s, they were one of the biggest bands in the world. They were playing to tens of thousands of people at the US Festival and Live Aid festivals, which were monumental events.
Peter, you write that tension starts to emerge around 1984's Heartbeat City from a variety of angles. To understand that tension, I think it's important to understand what's the personality of Rick Ocasek and Ben. What are these two guys like? What would you say about the personalities and the nature of the culture of the band?
It seems to be the case that Rick was very much a consumed artist who wanted to be taken seriously as an artist. And he also was the songwriter of the band, and he was directing everything musically. And Ben he loved to perform, and he obviously loved to sing. He's a great singer, but he wasn't a songwriter. There's one song that he wrote on the Milkwood records, not very memorable. From what people told me when I was working on the book, it seemed to be a case of Ben hitched his wagon to Rick, and Rick gave him the platform to shine on. And there was also feels for certain songs that had to really would be best served if sung by Ben, and Rick could not do that. So it seemed like a perfect case of being able to have it all artistically. But yeah, that kind of built up some resentments. Rick was obviously, he didn't really need to tour because as much as the other guys, because he was the writer. So he was getting this songwriting royalties as well as the performing royalties. The other guys were only getting the performing side of things.
And as we've talked about on many episodes, all the members collaborated on songs, but there isn't any royalties paid for arrangements.
Absolutely. And Rick also was getting more into producing and working in the studio, especially with other bands. Rick didn't like touring. The novelty of that wore off for him pretty early on. And he'd certainly been through paying his dues before, as had Ben. But Ben didn't have anything else besides getting out there and playing. And Rick was being artistically satisfied by seeing his songs come to life and become successful, and being able to go through the process of making the songs and recording them. And then the situation with their management, Elliot Roberts, who I mentioned before, he mainly worked with singer-songwriters like Jackson Browne and Joni Mitchell.
Mhm.
And that was the way he interacted with his acts that were on his roster. Elliot Roberts saw the entity of the Cars as Rick and these guys that he plays with and play his songs. And obviously the Cars, the whole thing worked because it was a combination of people that then the way they played those songs, and they knew what to do, and they knew what sounded great and what would work for the song.
The Cars' 1987 album, Door to Door, was considered a commercial disappointment. It was their lowest charting album. They had a single. It's really interesting. These guys by this time known each other nearing 20 years. Tell us a little bit about the bizarre rift that emerged between the two lifelong partners, Ocasek and Orr, over there was a girlfriend involved in writing songs of Orr's. Is that correct?
Yeah, Ben wanted to get involved in the songwriting side of things, and he came to Rick and said, "Hey, I've been writing songs with my girlfriend, and she writes lyrics. Can we have a couple of these on the next album?" And Rick just shut him right down. Was just, "That's not the Cars." And a few of those songs were on Ben's solo album, The Lace, which did very well commercially, but it doesn't really sound like the Cars. It's more, I would say, more straight ahead mainstreamy rock. There's no quirkiness, and the experimental elements of the Cars aren't really present in that music.
Peter, in your book, Orr was drinking and really isolating himself on tour.
Yeah, by the time they were touring door to door, when they were making that record, they weren't in the studio at the same time for much of the recording. And yeah, he was traveling separately. Ben and the rest of the band would fly, and he would ride with the crew on the bus and meet them in the next town was they were playing. And he'd become withdrawn. Obviously, he'd become resentful that Rick had become the face of the band in a lot of ways, and was also the one who was being seen as the quote unquote creative genius of the band. And they had been friends, and Ben felt he was getting left by the wayside and trivialized.
During the door-to-door tour in 1987, the mood was tense, and Ocasek was giving interviews in which he likened himself to Sting, who had to leave the Police to really get noticed. In 1988, the Cars disbanded, and longtime partners Rick Ocasek and Benjamin Orr entered a Cold War of not interacting with each other. In 1991, Ocasek marries the model Paulina Porzakova. This is his third marriage. She was a Sports Illustrated swimsuit model.
Oh, yeah, definitely. To be fair, Paulina, she was the most famous model in the world. She was a powerful force in the area that she worked in. It was two high-profile people coming together in that relationship.
And as the 90s emerged, younger bands really came to respect the achievements of the Cars and Rick Ocasek, and he went on to become a producer of some bands of note.
Yeah, Rick was a deep guy. He had always had his ear to the underground. He would encounter bands that he liked, that he thought were doing something interesting, and he would help them because he was a champion of what he thought was cool music. He also knew how to make records that would appeal to a lot of different people. And he said you can make money or you can make art. So to Rick, both things were valid in terms of making music that was interesting, experimental, challenging music, but that's not going to be commercially successful. But you could also make commercially successful music that was satisfying. They were both equally valid. So yeah, he worked with probably the biggest band he worked with was Weezer, the Blue album, which was
massive,
incredibly huge, super influential album that gave birth to a whole new generation of the term emo pop punk bands. And that record was a defining record for a certain generation of people that came of age in the early 1990s. And he had also produced, before that, I mentioned Suicide and the Bad Brains in the early 1980s. Around that time, he produced Romeo Void, the song Never Say Never, which was another big, influential, very unique, era-defining hit of the kind of early 80s new wave period. He produced
No Doubt.
He produced No Doubt. He worked on the Rocksteady record, a song or two off it.
In 2000, Benjamin Orr dies of cancer.
Yeah.
Despite their years of estrangement, apparently Ocasek and Orr reconciled shortly before Orr's death from pancreatic cancer. Ocasek later wrote the song Silver in memory of his old friend, quote, his old friend Ben.
Yeah.
But then I kind of forgot about this, but in 2011, they actually reformed with the album Move Like This.
Yeah. Yep. And that is a great record. There was some things that happened in between there. The rest of the band, Elliot Easton and Greg Hawkes, they put together a band called the New Cars. which featured Todd Rundgren as the lead singer and rhythm guitarist. And they went on tour. It didn't last very long. They were mainly doing Cars hits. So that kind of came and went. And Rick wasn't happy about it, but he knew the other guys wanted to work and he didn't want to stand in their way. So he kind of let that happen. But then right around 2010, he had been writing some newer songs, and I guess they didn't really feel to him like songs that would work on one of his own records as a solo record. And he just called up Elliot and Greg and David and said, hey, what do you think about us getting together and doing something as the Cars? And so that's how that came about. And I think it's a great record. I think there's some songs on there that are up there with, especially the single Blue Tip. I think that's up there with singles from their first couple albums.
The Cars made their triumphant return with the album Move Like This. Debuted at number 7 on the Billboard 200 and number 2 on the top rock albums chart, capturing their signature new wave sound with a modern twist. Blended crunchy guitars with synth pop, earning praise as a successful comeback. With a 3.5-star review from Rolling Stone, a brief but memorable 10-city tour followed, including a standout performance at Lollapalooza. Move Like This was widely seen as a successful reunion and became the perfect final chapter for the Cars. In April 2018, in a testament to their impact on the music history, the Cars were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame by Brandon Flowers, the lead singer of the Killers, and they performed together for the final time. Nearing the end here, Ocasek dies in 2019. He suffered from cardiovascular disease, emphysema, and he was recovering from an unspecified surgery when he died on September 15, 2019, in Manhattan. His wife, former model Paulina Porzakova, said he passed away peacefully in his sleep. What is the legacy of the Cars? What's the place in music history that they'll be remembered for?
I think just being a masterclass in how to put together tightly constructed, very memorable pop songs that have elements in them that are sonically and thematically challenging and interesting at the same time. A perfect hybrid of art and pop. I love a quote. There's a quote that Elliot Easton, he says, that first Cars album was the one sort of mainstreamy album that a lot of punks had in their collection, but it was also the one album that a lot of mainstream people had when they wanted to have something punky in their collection. So that's a rare proposition for a band that can please people that want challenging music and also people that want just easy to follow, catchy pop music. That and also combining sounds from different eras through that same kind of methodology.
It seemed like the Cars were one of the safe entries for rockers to get into that new wave. A lot of people who I would characterize as into more traditional rock had the Cars cassette tape and maybe the Police as well. But
yeah, absolutely. And that was important because that helped change mainstream music and keep it from getting too stagnant and keep it interesting. And also connecting a lot of underground people, giving them something to find in the pop world that they could latch onto.
Well, the last question we're going to ask you is, what 3 songs do you think the audience should give a listen or re-listen to?
I was dreading that. Tough question. It's hard. There's so many great ones. I would say Just What I Needed was
Sung by Benjamin Orr.
Sung by Benjamin Orr, written by Rick. Just a song that I find it impossible not to like, no matter how many times I hear it. That song that put them on the map, a song that broke them through. So I think it's important for that reason alone. Going a little bit deeper, from Candio, Double Life. I think that's my favorite Cars song.
Hmm.
And that's one that Rick sings. And it's just got this just incredible, poignant, atmospheric, very addictive feel to it. Interesting that it's maybe also a little incongruous because that's one that Greg Hawkes doesn't play keyboards on. He plays guitar on. But I just love that song. I just want to hear it over and over again. And it shows that introverted, brooding side that's a defining aspect of Rick's personality. And then for the last one, I'm going to go a little deeper again, and I'm going to say Up and Down from Panorama, which is a very pulsing electronic type of tune. And I think that's an important part of the Cars sound is that. And I think that that song shows that in a perfect way.
Our guest today has been the author of Moving in Stereo, which has the subtitle Rick Ocasek, the driving force behind the Cars. And our guest has been Peter Aaron. Peter, your book, I really enjoyed a look behind a very compelling, unique character. Rick Ocasek is a mystery figure in the history of rock, but clearly, as you've outlined in this interview and in that book, this man took several sounds from way back in the 1950s from Buddy Holly through to several iterations of bands and created a very unique sound that cranked through the charts of the late 70s and early 80s and even into the screens of MTV. And today you've really illuminated that journey, and we want to thank you for coming.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on. It's been a pleasure. Hopefully this will get people to go back and listen to the Cars music if they haven't listened to it, and Rick's music, anything associated with him in a while. And hopefully it will get some younger fans to check it out and see why it matters and find something for themselves in it as well.
Absolutely. Thanks again.
Blast Furnace Labs production.